Okay, hello, my friends. My name is Gerdes. It is Tuesday, November 26th, and this is three big stories. And wow, are these some big stories. So the first is this. NATO, it appears, has potentially grown a spine. NATO Parliamentary Assembly calls for medium-range missiles, that includes potentially Tomahawks, to aid Ukraine's defense and aggression deterrence. So this is part of Zelensky's victory plan, and it looks like Ukraine actually might be getting this. Now, they're just passing this. They're not to the point of actually delivering anything or actually deciding that they're going to deliver anything even. This measure aims to strengthen Ukraine's strategic position and aligns with NATO's commitment to Euro-Atlantic security. And so we see NATO has endorsed sending Ukraine all the means, including medium-range missiles, quote, to defend itself and deter further aggression, unquote. This is stated in Resolution 494, adopted by the Plenary Assembly. Okay, so wow. Now, I see things like this and I go, okay, what? This is Douglas Macgregor saying, breaking, NATO now discussing the possibility of preemptive strikes against Russia, according to Bauer. No, that's not what it was. And my comment back to him was 1,000+ days. It's a little too late to be preemptive, don't you think? But he's not actually in reality talking about what's going on. This is what Admiral Bauer had actually what he was proposing. NATO may strike Russian weapon systems if Russia attacks first. That's not a preemptive strike. That is, if they're attacked, they may strike back at Russian systems. And the reason that he's talking about that is because Russia keeps talking about how we're going to strike NATO, we're going to hit them, we're going to nuke them, we're going to do whatever. Okay. His remarks follow ruler Vladimir Putin's threats of retaliation over Western long-range missiles use against targets in Russia. So if you go into the actual article, this is Euromaidan Press, and see what it had to say. On in November 2024, Russian ruler Vladimir Putin escalated threats against the West. Putin warned that Russia might retaliate against Western nations supporting these Ukrainian operations. So he's saying, if this happens, guess what? We're going to strike your weapon systems. And so that's what's going on here. The admiral also admitted that NATO is discussing the possibility of strikes on weapon systems if it attacks the alliance first. So again, that's a retaliatory, not a preemptive strike. It's a discussion that is relatively young in NATO, and I'm very happy that we had it, and we've now changed this attitude. The idea is that we are a defensive alliance and we'll only sit and wait until we are attacked, and when we are attacked, we will be able to shoot down the arrows that come at us. But it's smarter not only to do that, but also to attack the archer that is in Russia if Russia attacks us. So that's hardly a preemptive strike, as Macgregor was talking about. But Colonel Macgregor often gets things very wrong. NATO Military Committee Chief emphasizes that the alliance only regards targeting Russian weapon systems in case it delivers the first blow, as it is not going to attack Russia out of nothing. To endure a potential attack, NATO needs more air defenses, which is one of the lessons from Ukraine. So at least they're paying attention and they're thinking about the possibilities here and what they would do. Meanwhile, Pete Hegseth, the Trump Pentagon pick, attacks the UN and NATO and urges the U.S. to ignore the Geneva Conventions. This is in The Guardian. Hegseth's policy preferences may raise concerns about the future of NATO. Like Trump, Hegseth characterizes NATO allies as not paying their way. Quote, NATO is not an alliance. It's a defensive arrangement for Europe, paid for and underwritten by the United States. Well, that is the feeling that the Trump camp has about NATO. So they need to be paying their 2% plus in order to be part of this and not just be free riding in economic terms. Quote, Europe has already allowed itself to be invaded. It chose not to rebuild its militaries, happily suckling off the teat of America's willingness to actually fight and win wars, unquote. Again, more of that same sentiment. The defense of Europe is not our problem. Been there, done that twice, Hegseth writes, adding, quote, NATO is a relic and should be scrapped and remade in order for freedom to be truly defended. This is what Trump is fighting for, he concludes. Okay, so that's where Hegseth is. Meanwhile, Ben Hodges says NATO a relic. Dear Mr. Hegseth, did you ever wonder why every nation which was once under Russian control or threat rushed to join NATO at the first opportunity, and why others are in a queue? That's right. NATO is pretty popular given that Finland, Sweden just joined. Cyprus is talking about joining now, and Ukraine desperately wants to join. Our civilian infrastructure, Ben Hodges goes on, most of which is used by our military, is under attack. The Russians know that NATO deterrence and defenses depend on rapid reinforcements. That's why they're attacking it. When do we realize that we are not at peace, no matter how much we wish it? Yeah, I mean, you can say we don't want war, but I think the Russians are acting as if they are at war. Czech intelligence chief warns against a weak peace in Ukraine. If Ukraine accepts a weak peace terms with Russia, it poses a strategic threat to Central and Eastern Europe. I think that's right. I think it's only a matter of time. It's a peace in our times is not the way to go. Chancellor Scholz explains that Germany stands, he's doubling down now on his previous position. Germany stands on not delivering Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Quote, as the biggest supporter of Ukraine's ability to defend itself, we refrain from certain actions like providing cruise missiles or enabling strikes deep into Russian territory. This is the course supported by the majority of citizens which I represent. So he's hiding behind the people. Now, if he is right, he should be easily reelected. And if he is wrong, he will not be. So we'll see how that works out, whether he's right or wrong. And he also talked about his phone call with Putin, which he said it was necessary to talk. It really wasn't, but he said it was necessary to talk, even if the conversation was far from pleasant. He didn't need to have the conversation, and it wasn't necessary to talk. Next, rich Russians and Russian officials are very concerned about the information that Cyprus is allegedly planning to join NATO. Okay, even Cyprus wants to join NATO. Now, Cyprus was a hangout of the Russians. It is known that many of them have assets, real estate there, and many relatives of the Russian leadership live there. This is what they write. Quote, more and more information is leaking out that Cyprus is planning to join NATO. It seems that the Cyprus region, beloved by Russians, will finally cease to be friendly. Yeah, that could happen. Ukraine is also on track to join the EU by 2030. That seems like a long way away, but they have to clean up some things like judicial and anti-corruption efforts, which are underway. They're working at it, but again, they have the Soviet Union hangover that they are trying to get away from. Now, we're talking about NATO. Let's look over in Asia. Ukraine's Minister of Defense, Umerov, will reportedly travel to South Korea to request provision of the country's weapons on November 27th. That's tomorrow, according to the South China Morning Post. And South Korea, Japan, and Australia and the Philippines, to a lesser degree, are kind of like the Asian NATO. They're kind of aligned with NATO, even if they're not North Atlantic. Russia categorically rejects any options for freezing the conflict in Ukraine. Sergei Narashkin, director of Foreign Intelligence Service of Russia, says. He added that Russia wants to, quote, establish a solid peace plan around Ukraine for years to come. Well, that's what Ukraine wants, but they're clearly at cross purposes about what that would actually look like. By solid peace, he means Ukrainian capitulation and Russian victory. But how are they going to be able to sustain this? Now, the Russian economy is the key here, and the Russian economy is in bad shape. The ruble just seems to be doing terribly over the last couple of weeks. And here Jason J. Smart says the ruble has lost 6% of its value over the past 5 business days, 20% of its value this year. Inflation is devouring the Russian economy. But wait, there's more. Oil prices, if they drop to $50 per barrel, would force the ruble devaluation to $1 to 135 or 155. Like, that would significantly hurt the Russian economy. Okay. Anton Geroshenko, there are clear signs that the Russian economy is headed toward collapse. Well, I don't know. And I hesitate to say that and say, yes, that's correct, because we just don't know exactly how far. But these are all unhealthy signs. Resources are being used to the maximum. Prices are increasing. The Russian central bank cannot stop them. Inflation rose again. Only certain industries are growing in Russia, primarily machinery. It's mostly what goes to be destroyed in Ukraine. And that's the only place that's thriving, the only healthy part of the economy. The International Monetary Fund predicts that the Russian economy will slow down threefold from 3.9% growth this year to 1.3% next year. This is 3.5 times less than in developed countries and 5 to 6 times less than in China or India. Now, I hadn't heard this statistic. A total of 4,363 legal Russian entities were declared bankrupt in the first 6 months of 2024, which is 40% more than in the same period a year earlier. He is running the economy into the ground in order to obtain Ukraine. Now, if he can obtain this real estate in Ukraine and actually hold on to it, it'll all be worth it in his calculation. Just think of the millions or even billions in mineral resources that he could steal from Donbass. Okay, interestingly, this graphic of the ruble to dollar clearly marks Russia's attack on Georgia in 2008, Russia's occupation of Crimea in 2014, Russia's massive attack on Ukraine in 2022, Western reluctancy in 2022, Ukraine's counteroffensive in 2022, long-range strikes in 2024. And when you see these little spikes on here, yeah, that's marking all these events. It's really interesting to compare those notes. Okay. Average cost of a mortgage in Russia has already exceeded 30%. Do you know what a 30% mortgage looks like? It means that you'll pay 7 times more than the original cost for the house over 25 years. Just think about how that's going to affect the average Russian homeowner. Third and final big story. This is Georgescu. He is the Romanian candidate who won the first round of the presidential elections. Now, this is the Euromaidan press saying, ignore the electoral noise. Georgescu's TikTok triumph signals nothing about Ukraine, says a Romanian ex-diplomat. The first round of presidential elections in Romania left many flabbergasted. Anti-NATO, anti-Ukraine, ultra-nationalist Georgescu, against all the polls, ended up in first place with 22.94%, beating political heavyweights like the sitting prime minister. The 62-year-old former UN consultant, who will face another electoral dark horse, with 19.18% in the runoff, has called NATO's missile defense system in Romania a shame of diplomacy and praised Putin as a man who loves his country. So a couple things. One, he sounds in his rhetoric like he's pro-Putin. Second thing, for all of you who have said, I don't understand a two-party system, well, I don't understand this. Like, both of these came from parties that are these obscure little parties on the periphery, and now this is what's left, is these obscure parties fighting it out in the final election. The article says this was more of a victory for the TikTok algorithms than anything else. This time, none of the major parties got into a second round, which tells us that the traditional political party systems in Romania completely collapsed yesterday as, like Georgescu, Lasconi, the competitor, doesn't represent a big political party either. We had 14 candidates. She's the most pro-Ukraine, the most pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-everything. Now, it's a clear choice between the Soviet Union and the EU. If you listen to this guy, they're talking about Georgescu, he won't shut up about how great life was back in the day. Also, we keep hearing about the silent majority. That was very true in the US, especially in 2016. You don't tell anybody that you're going to vote for Trump, although you're just fed up with everything. And that's where they were in the US. And that happened in 2024 as well. People would just keep their opinions to themselves so they wouldn't get shouted down by a friend or on Facebook. And then they went into the voting booth and voted for Trump. And he won every swing state. So we couldn't see it in the polls. Now, this was an interesting bit in the article as well. Trump likely approved the Ukrainian long-range strikes into Russia. Now, that doesn't mean that he had the right to approve, but it seems like he was informed about what was happening moving forward. Romania is very pro-Ukraine. When Russia launched an illegal, brutal war, people rushed to the border, brought food, and waited to help. There were more people at the border than Ukrainian refugees. We also gave you the Patriot system, which is quite a big deal, and that's true, they did. Trump is unpredictable, but it's also part of his strategy. I think that's very fair. Just look at the long-range strikes, which were likely given the green light by Trump. Again, he's not the decider, but if he was informed and said, yeah, go ahead and do that, that's a different picture than what you might have had before the election. Multiple sources familiar with the subject have indicated that he approved them. Plus, it's highly unlikely that the outgoing Biden administration would do something like that without consulting Trump. So that paints a very interesting picture about what Trump might or might not do. Okay, last little bit just for fun. Sergei Sumileny posted this. By the way, in Russia, they published children's books about how evil character of the US dollar and about its weaknesses. The title is How Brave Ruble Has Defeated the Treacherous US Dollar. Well, that sounds like it's a wonderful book for children. All right, my friends, that's all that I have for you. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.